Well, it is great to be here. Again, my name is Steve Dauphin. I'm a director with the Kirchner Impact Foundation. I know I'm supposed to say howdy, but I'm just not quite there yet, okay? I'm going to work on it. Maybe the next trip I'll be really there and able to do it. So I'm thrilled to be here today. Thrilled to be here today, particularly talking about this topic. Before I dive in, though, a little on the Kirchner Foundation, the Kirchner Group. The Kirchner Group's a traditional merchant bank, very active in agriculture and agriculture-related investments for over 30 years. The commercial engine is the Kirchner Group. The Kirchner Impact Foundation was set up really to do experimentation, capital markets experiments, trying to find new ways to solve old problems, and thrilled certainly to be a part of that. On the commercial side, an indication of some of the work, recently we were involved in a Series C round, $100 million Series C round, a company called Indigo, which is looking based out of Boston, which is doing some fantastic work with water uptake in plants. So we feel very fortunate to be in the mix on a lot of the newest technology items. But for this topic, I am so thankful to be here. And I would much rather be here than in Washington at Department of Agriculture or on Capitol Hill, or in New York at the UN, or on Wall Street, because I believe wholeheartedly that these problems that have been around for a long time will not be solved with solutions coming out of those places. And I believe wholeheartedly they'll be solved with solutions coming out of places like this. And so couldn't be happier to be here today. All right, assumptions are very powerful things. Assumptions are very dangerous things, or can be. And I'm going to tell you a story about that as it relates to something I was involved in years ago. In a prior life, long ago, I was a special agent with the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration. I was based in Phoenix, Arizona, and we mostly worked with biker gangs, methamphetamine traffickers. And I was new. I was a new agent. I was very green. My partner was very seasoned. My partner, he was, when you think special agent, that was my partner. He made the largest undercover cocaine bust in U.S. history. I, however, if you've ever seen the film Fletch, I was more like Fletch, all right? I was the FedEx guy, the phone repairman. Those were my undercover assignments. Anyway, I was pretty green, and my partner had been looking for a bad guy for a while, and we were driving in an area called Apache Junction in Phoenix, if any of you are from Phoenix, and we thought we saw him in this house. And so we geared up and we drove up and pretty quickly. And as we were driving up to try to arrest him, he quickly moved behind a Camaro, a primer gray Camaro. And the hood of that Camaro was up. And so he moved behind the hood and we couldn't see him. He was behind the hood. And we got out of the cars and we started to go up. My partner was going up on the left. I was going up on the right. And again, being fairly green, at that point, my brain, the fight or flight action in my brain was going crazy. Literally, my field of vision started to shrink, okay? My ability to think creatively was being jettisoned every step I took, okay? I was becoming less thoughtful. And of course, we had assumed that he would be armed and dangerous. We knew he was dangerous, but we assumed that he would be armed. And so as we're going up, I kind of come around the right side. I see him raise up, and in his hand is a black object, and it looks like his finger is on the trigger. And I am this close to pulling the trigger on my gun to shoot him when I realize that he's holding a drill in his hand and not a gun. And of course, I'm incredibly thankful to this day that I didn't pull the trigger. But as soon as I realized that it was a drill, all of a sudden the field of vision started to expand. I could start to think again. I could start to think about the solution. Had anyone seen us arrest him? Could we get him back to the office in time? Could we get him to try to cooperate and help us catch another bad guy? But until that moment, and based on that false assumption, I couldn't think rationally. And it's my opinion that many of us that are thinking about this critically important issue are coming at it, and I think we've got a few assumptions that are off. And I'm going to propose today, I'm going to talk about 3 assumptions that I think we don't have them framed properly, and we're going to try to take a look at those. Those 3 assumptions are, I think many of us are trying to solve the wrong problem. I think we're trying to use the wrong experts. and I think we're taking the wrong approach. So we've all seen a chart like this. This is probably why we're all here, is a chart like this. And this is, of course, a graph of population growth, and then that extra red piece is the fact that people want to eat more protein, and so that's putting more stress and strain on the planet to increase food production. And we like to say, we all say, and I've said so many times, we have to double food supply between now and 2050. And that's true. But when we say it that way, again, I think that raises a perception. It's a terrifying problem. Okay, I believe when you start to think that way, I believe your ability to think creatively is reduced. But if you think about it another way, and if you think about it from a mathematical perspective, to double something's really not that hard if you have enough time. So to double something between now and 2050, we have 34 years. If we can just increase production or reduce waste 2.06% every year between now and 2050, we can double food supply. The problem, in my opinion, that we are facing, and this is, I believe, highly doable. I see companies every day. We're looking to put money out in great companies. And I'll see a company over here that if their technology were adopted, it would increase production 50%. Or a company over here that could reduce waste 70%. On and on and on and on. Fantastic companies with great technologies that make 2% a layup. I really believe if you can move capital properly, that doubling food supply between now and 2050 is in the bag, if the problem were only a production problem. But I think the biggest problem, and this is from a global perspective, this isn't necessarily a North American perspective, is a geography problem. The problem isn't the ability to increase production. The problem is the ability to get those solutions out everywhere in the world where they're needed. So I believe the area of greatest innovative need are companies and solutions and technologies that work on the problem of technology solution distribution. All right? I'll give you an example. This is a good example of someone who, it's an example of a problem that wouldn't come to mind as the first thing you might think about. I don't know, do any of you here know Dr. Ed Price, Texas A&M professor? How about Norman Borlaug, the late Norman Borlaug? Show of hands? Okay. All right. It's not, most people don't. That's about, most time it's 1 in 50 would know Norman Borlaug. It should be much higher. And I would argue he's one of the most important human beings that's ever lived. And I would encourage you, if you don't know his name, to go online and Google Norman Borlaug and Penn and Teller, the comedians Penn and Teller. Just type that in, and you're going to get a 3-minute clip, and it's fantastic. It's a little bit salty, but it's fantastic. And Norman Borlaug, of course, did great work, affiliated with Texas A&M, part of the great ag tradition there, who developed strains of wheat and rice that literally saved billions of people, and known as the father of the Green Revolution by many. Dr. Ed Price traveled with him and worked closely with Dr. Borlaug. Dr. Price is a remarkable person in his own right, and if there's anyone on the planet who ought to have a good view of this big problem of how do we feed everyone on the planet, he would certainly be on the list. So I asked him this question not that long ago. I was with him. I said, Dr. Price, if you were king, I mean, literally, I said this way, if you were king for a day and could make one single change to solve the global hunger problem, what would it be? And he said, well-defined property rights. It wasn't a new seed. It wasn't something from outer space, satellite technology. It was well-defined property rights. And of course, within that, of course, intellectual property rights would be a subset. I think he meant it in a more broad, with land rights and other forms of rights. But that, to me, is an indication that maybe the problem that we've been chasing isn't the one is the right one or the most obvious. Assumption 2, who are the right people to be trying to tackle this problem? So I'm about to show you a map, and you'll immediately recognize the geography of the map. On the map, there are white areas, there are light green, and there are dark green areas. The dark green areas are places where chronic so regular and serious hunger, where people are hungry on a regular basis, more than 30% of the population. Okay? So dark green, serious hunger problems. All right? How is it? We're talking about solving global hunger problems. It's 2016. In the richest country on earth, with the best infrastructure on earth, with maybe the best legal system on earth to try to address these problems, that we haven't solved the problem. I don't really know the answer to that, but it does suggest to me that maybe the way we've been going at the problem, and maybe the experts that are trying to solve the problem, maybe it's time to give the keys to somebody else. Maybe we need somebody else to try to solve the global problem, much less the problem here in the United States. And I think we are at a truly remarkable for that kind of change, truly remarkable moment for that kind of change. And this was touched on earlier. I think Shannon had a slide that was in the same neighborhood of what I'm about to say. So we've had 84,000 generations as hunters and gatherers. Okay? We had maybe 2,000 generations of production agriculture in some form. We've had 10 generations since the Industrial Revolution. This is the first generation with ubiquitous access to all information, good and bad, as we talked about, that's ever been known or written. This is a fundamentally different moment. And someone my age has to think about that I have to think about it up here. Okay, so I have to say, okay, there's this internet thing, and you can do that, and this thing over here, and then there's the Twitter, and then there's the Facebook, and so I get it all wrong. So, but if you grew up in it, you're native to it, and you can see possibilities that I can't see. You can say, well, that ought to be, we ought to be able to fix that because I know you can do it over here. So it's native. The technology is native, and I believe that's a fundamentally important distinction. With our portfolio companies, and we invest and work with lots of companies that use technology, if we're having a strategic planning session, it is not strategic unless there is someone, or more than hopefully one, person that is native to the new technology in the room. By definition, it's not a strategic meeting if you don't have folks in the room who are native to the new technologies and possibilities. Obviously, it's a fully networked world. And there are obviously remote areas that are not, and people are working diligently on that. Solutions are distributed and will be increasingly distributed. Solutions won't be out of necessarily, if we think about fertilizer or power generation, it should be that while there will always be large plants that have great economies of scale, more and more things will be produced locally using local inputs in a much more distributed way. Customized, everything can be customized now. Heck, 5-10 years ago, you could get a pair of sneakers made on Nike.com however you wanted them. Dial it up, put your name on it, same color, make the stripe different, hit buy, and it's sent to your house. Mass customization, mass distribution, and networked. And then there's also a certain impatience. And that's, of course, a double-edged sword. But there is an impatience that seems to be coming with the territory of natives to the technology, that they want things and they want them relatively quickly. Now, my favorite example of this, I was down in Nicaragua attempting to work with some farmers. And again, I'm not a farmer. I wish I were. I'm not a farmer. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a PhD. I'm just trying to invest in some good companies that might make the world a little better place. But I was down there working with some farmers, and they really, even a non-farmer could tell, they were nowhere close to best practices. Most of the farmers, I went to 6 different farms, and the practices were just terrible. And again, that's from an uninformed, everyone in this room would have said, wow, that's not good. Most of the farmers were probably, it's hard to tell the age, but probably say, somewhere between 35 and 55 or 65. I went over the hill, 7th farm, and I couldn't believe it. He had cobbled together a drip irrigation system somehow. He had 5 or 6 crops. He was growing peppers. Everybody else was just growing corn and maybe some beans. He had 5 or 6 crops. He was rotating crops. It was really beautiful. It was lush, what he had done. And the farmer was about 20 years old. And through the translator, I asked him, I said, how did you do this? And he said, well, and it's a pretty remote area. He said, well, down that road, about 10 miles, there's a village, a little town. And in that town, there's a library. And in that library, there's a machine. And on that machine, you can go on this thing, and it'll tell you everything you need to know about how to grow things differently. It's amazing. What's so important about that to me, it was great that he'd figured it out, but it was really at two levels. One, he had figured it out, but secondly, that he believed it. I mean, and again, I'm relatively new to this topic, and so I don't know the culture of farmers that well, but it does seem to be a group that doesn't like to change the way they do things very, very rapidly, okay? And then certainly in Nicaragua, when you could show someone, here's something where you could make twice as much money than this, so many times, again, clearly I don't understand all the cultural nuances, they'll stick with what they're doing. But it was two things, the ability to find the problem, but then a willingness to try to do it. And that's an indication to me, anecdotal, that maybe this millennial mindset, it's not just a North American thing. And maybe there's a moment to begin rethinking global ag extension, for example, in some new ways, which obviously a lot of people are working on very well. Here's an example. Young guy, Canadian. And of course, iron deficiency to me is a form of hunger. Micronutrients are you're hungry, even if you're getting the calorie count and your stomach doesn't hurt if you're not getting appropriate micronutrients. So iron deficiency to me is a hunger issue. That's a hunger issue because your body is not being fed what it needs. So the young scientist from Canada was in Cambodia, and he was working on research in iron deficiency. And he was in a remote little village. And he had a thought. He said, my grandma used to cook in cast iron cookware. What if we could get people to cook in cast iron cookware? Would that be a way for the iron comes out of the cookware into the food, you consume the food, and it helps you with your issues of iron deficiency. So he said, that's a great idea. So he tried to get people to use cast iron pots. Terrible, it's a disaster. Too heavy, too expensive. They usually had to walk long distances. They like to cook in aluminum. That's just the way it was. So he said, all right, that didn't work. And he went back, and then he said, well, what if I took some iron and I cut it up into little blocks? And as they're boiling up their rice or their soup, take the iron block and put it in the pot. And he did some research on it and tested it in the lab or had people test it in the lab, and sure enough, it works. If you have the right iron, and all iron isn't the same, but if you have the right iron and you put it in the pot, the iron comes out of the bar into the food, you consume the food, and it can solve your iron deficiency problem. So he tried that, and that didn't work because nobody wants to put a block of iron in their pot when they're cooking up the rice or the soup. And he thought it was another dead end. And again, what he's trying to get people off of are iron supplement pills, which are incredibly expensive. For a family, a typical family in a developing economy, for 5 years, it costs about $500 to get the proper iron supplements in their diet in the form of like a vitamin or a pill. And people hate them, and the stomach doesn't feel right. There's a lot of reasons why people don't like those iron pills. So that's the problem he was trying to solve. But he hadn't solved it yet until someone that he worked with locally that knew the culture better than he did, said, you know what? In this country, the fish is an example, is a symbol for good luck. So what if we take the bar and we cast it into the shape of a fish? And, fish like to be in water. So will they put the fish in the water? So they cast it in the shape of a fish. People would put it in their pot. They started to feel better. They actually started to feel better. The fish was, in fact, lucky because it was making them feel better. And the uptake was fantastic. The cost for 5 years for a family to cook with an iron fish in their pot is $25. Delivered, trained, in the market. So think about that. $475 of money that's coming from Red Cross or Gates or whoever's funding that can now be used for something else. And he set this up as a business. right? Because he wanted it to be sustainable and he wanted it to be replicable. And you can go online now to see Lucky Ironfish is certainly growing very well. But it's a good example of a new way of coming at an old problem. So assumption three is we need more money, right? Everybody likes to say, oh, we need more, we got to throw more money at this problem. I believe that is absolutely incorrect. And my main source for this is the president of the how many folks know Zamorano University in Honduras? Great university, fantastic. Jeffrey Lansdale is the president, and he and I were together recently and talking about this issue. And what he said to me, and he was, of course, appropriately grateful for everyone that's trying to help. He's a fantastic human being. But what he said to me, he said, Steve, go look at this study prepared by PGC. And what you're going to see is in Honduras, aid, mostly from governments, was $2.1 billion. $2.1 billion of aid for the country of Honduras from 2010 to 2012. Now again, this is a short window, so you can't really make a lot of conclusions on this. But during that same period of time, Honduras poverty was actually increasing from 60% to 66%. I'm not trying to make that connection. The point I'm trying to make is it's a tremendous amount of money. A tremendous amount of money that, and he would say over a much longer sweep of time, is simply not working. That really shouldn't be a surprise if we think about most of this money is coming from governmental entities. And governments, of course, have important work to do. I'm not saying they don't. But they're terrible. The government is a terrible allocator of capital. And it's logical. It's logical because their informational feedback loop is way too long and way too convoluted. You don't know the effect the money is having at the end user. The other extreme is a small business. Small business has an incredibly short and immediate feedback loop, which says, am I creating more value and am I able to capture it? Am I creating more value and capturing more valuable than it costs me to make it? That inconvenient, unbelievably relentless bottom line, which is a fantastic feedback loop to give you clues about how you might want to allocate your next dollar. The government think about it. Think about the process by which the government makes decisions about how to allocate a dollar. I'm not saying that obviously the big stuff only governments can do, and by and large do some fantastic work on those big things. But to solve a bunch of problems in a bunch of different corners over the world, every problem which is customized, every problem which is local, which is this village leader doesn't get along with that village leader. That's an impossible task for governmental bodies to allocate capital. The far better engine, which doesn't always work, and I would argue easily the greatest poverty-reducing engine in human history by a mile. There are two fantastic engines. The first one is the seed. This amazing thing that we figured out 2,000 generations ago that you can put in the ground and you can add stuff to it that costs you this much. When done right, can make something that's of far greater value. That's really the first big jump of value creation. The second one, I believe, is voluntary exchange for mutual benefit. Or in this country, we would think about it as free market capitalism. Voluntary exchange for mutual benefit. Another great, if you just take a look at North and South Korea. South Korea was one of the poorest countries on earth. Poorest countries on earth at the end of the Korean War. And one side had voluntary exchange for mutual benefit and the other didn't. And you look at where they are today. One is still one of the poorest countries on earth and the other is not. This is an incredibly powerful tool which we need to harness better. It's really, I think of for-profit business, and it's not perfect, and we'll get to that, as the big engine. You look out the window, we see these trains go by. Nothing is more efficient than moving goods on land than a train. But you can't just take a train and put it in the middle of a field. It'll just sit there in the dirt. So yes, something has to come before. Governments have to go before. Governments have to say, okay, this is where the train's going to go. This is the track where it's going to go. And for-profit business can't do that. Maybe that's the role of a nonprofit. Maybe that's the role of government. But when the track is laid, nothing is better at moving goods than free market capitalism. It is the big engine, and that is the machine we have to harness. Now, the issue, though, I believe, is this, and it's not dissimilar from some of the conversations earlier about companies misstepping as it relates to communication around GMOs. There's a reason why people don't trust business. There are a lot of reasons why people don't trust business. Because business, we have made unbelievable mistakes. We have been driven to a ridiculous degree by complexity and greed. Oftentimes a term is used, crony capitalism. All right. We've earned the distrust of consumers. We've earned the heavy hand of regulation because we didn't behave. That is a self-inflicted wound of business that we did this. And I have no love for the complexity. Yes, there are some good things that happen on Wall Street, but the complexity and the greed-driven culture of Wall Street is a very, very dangerous thing. The good news, I believe, is that there is a movement, and people call it a new thing, but to me it's almost like going back to the really old thing. I imagine there were some companies in Ardmore that what I describe when people think now about a conscious business or a B Corp or a company that's, you pick your flavor, social entrepreneurship, pick your term. It's really basically saying we're going to have a business. We're going to treat our employees well. We're going to treat our stakeholders well. We're going to treat our suppliers the right way. We're going to treat the environment the right way. And we're going to have a passion for what we do. That engine, when that's the DNA, that's not externally imposed. That is the DNA of the business. That is how it operates, is the most powerful engine of economic good on the planet today, without question. Companies that we work with, the ones that do the best, always, are companies that have a sense of purpose in the culture of that organization. We have a company that manages intersections in a better way. And they can reduce accidents, they can reduce congestion, they can reduce fuel consumption, which reduces pollution. Well, they wake up in the morning and they are traffic control freaks. That's all they think about. They are so excited about this thing and making the world a better place. They overcome obstacle after obstacle after obstacle, and they're defeating companies that aren't built the same way. And more of that is an important part of how we will solve the problem. So a thesis would be that as we think about problems that are out there, how about let's first think about, is there an evolved for-profit solution? Because if you think about it, and people say, well, why the emphasis on profit? Everything out here, everything out the window, every car, every railroad track, almost everything, this building that we're in, this university, is a result of profit. Profit that was either reinvested, profit that was taxed and redistributed, or profit that was earned and given away. All right? Profit drives all of that. So if we can solve a problem with a for-profit business, that is by far the best tool that we can bring. Nonprofits that are engaged in the fight, I believe, also have to evolve. One of my favorite groups is a group particularly groups that are involved in economic development. That's really the most focused version of where I think this evolution needs to be. So one of my favorite groups is a group in Washington, D.C. called D.C. Central Kitchens. And their two founders are really known because they are incredibly impatient and they swear like crazy. If you put them up in front of a group, they will embarrass you. Okay? They are completely irreverent, but they are fantastic at doing what they do. And they really have two guiding principles about all of their nonprofit activities. The first is, if they're trying to solve a problem, part of the solution is, how do we work ourselves out of business? How do we do whatever else we need to do to make the need for us go away? Which is, I believe, should be an exit philosophy that most nonprofits, not governmental extensions, but most nonprofits should have a mindset of, how do I work myself out of business? How do I solve the problem to the degree that I'm not needed anymore? The other thing they think about is they experiment with solutions that for-profit business is not courageous enough to try. They are courageous enough. Their capital has a different set of demands than the capital I invest, so they can take some chances that we can't take. When they find something that works, spin it out into a for-profit business, and maybe even give a piece of the ownership to the people that you're working with in your community. So, but work yourself out of the business that you're in or spin it out. And then, of course, would be the government. But I tend to think if we think about problems and we think about trying to come at them in these steps, I think that's the right and appropriate hierarchy. So we're working with a couple of great companies. Now I'm going to give you a few examples. We have an investment in a company in Peru called SharedX. It's a farm. The real drivers behind it are a former Kleiner Perkins partner, a guy named John Denniston, who retired from Kleiner Perkins and made this a big part of his life's work. And a gentleman named Tony Salas from Peru, who is, I would argue, one of the best agricultural experts in the country. And they said, okay, there's a big market for high-value organic crops. And again, they're not fighting the tape. They're not in the argument of organic versus not organic. They're saying there's a market for it. How can I grow stuff and sell into this market and make money? In SharedX, the theory was, okay, what if we get the best practices in the world, period? We go to the best place that we can think of in the world to grow these crops, period. How can we do? With also a greater amount of capital than most farmers have. So it's a little bit different way to think about totally trying to rethink production. They've been able to enjoy yield increases of 200%. 200% over regional organic practices, which, by the way, weren't great, but remarkable, and they're able to export profitably, highly profitably, and grow rapidly. So we're thrilled to be a part of SharedX. It's a great experiment. On a much smaller scale, we're involved with a farm in Nicaragua, which is trying to say, what's the minimum viable farm? There's a bit of romance around the smallholder farmer idea. And in development circles, you hear a lot about we have to help the smallholder farmer, and we do. But it's not asking the other question, which does the smallholder farmer size make sense? There are economic realities that can't be ignored. And so what NICA-X is trying to do is actually taking some of these best practices from SharedX, which is, by the way, open book. Any local farmer that wants to go see what SharedX is doing, they can come there. So they really have a dual mission. It is to prove something, but also to share that knowledge with others. The same idea here, but it's trying to say, okay, rather than, and there's a group from Tulsa who's been very active in this, rather than saying, okay, wow, there's these great ag practices, let's go down and teach them what to do. They said, hey, let's see if we can make any money. We're going to buy a piece of land. We're going to show our checkbook to the world, and we're going to see if we can make money with all these great contacts and networks and people with whom we communicate, working with the very best local farmers that we can find. Can we make money? And if the answer is no, then you have to say, well, okay, did we do something wrong? Do we need to change the plan? Or is the footprint too small? Do we have to evolve it? So NICA-X is a great experiment that we're involved in. This is one thing we're not directly involved in, but I wanted to mention to this group. I was in a conversation recently with a woman who runs the Novartis Foundation on the healthcare side. And a fascinating discussion took place about agriculture and intellectual property. And they thought many of the fights that are about to happen or the issues that are going to be tackled in agriculture, many of them have already been faced, particularly as it relates to global economic development, have already been faced by healthcare. There are a variety of very innovative licensing agreements that may be models in agriculture. And there really does need to be an increased, and I'm sure there are good people on the case that are thinking about this issue, but to really, really focus on healthcare and try to think ahead and say, okay, that was a good model with AIDS drugs. Is how do we get it to a place where the money wasn't sufficient? Or another example where, and this is really interesting from an investor perspective, we invest in a company. That company is saying, I'm going to go to market, and all they're thinking about is North America and Europe, or China. Again, this is below the level of Dow and Bayer and Syngenta. They're obviously thinking globally immediately, but with a company that's rapidly growing, young, and starting up, what they're trying to get to is the markets where the money are. At that point, they're not even thinking about Nicaragua. It's just not even an issue in terms of their view of the value that they're creating. but they might be getting research done at a university to try to help them grow. Well, maybe in there, are there some models from healthcare, but we're a way that you could say, okay, we get the big markets and you want to have the intellectual property rights for this particular region of the world, but maybe we can do something different for other regions of the world that you don't even care about, all right? And so some thinking needs to go on, some innovation needs to go on there, and it probably is. I'm sure folks are doing some good work on it. But certainly this study from healthcare taking a look at smarter ways to get ahead of IP issues on ag so that we don't end up with IP that we can't get to places where it needs to go rapidly. And then this is the one that I'm involved with most closely, which is the Kirchner Food Fellowship. And for those of you who aren't third year, I would encourage you to think about applying next year to this fellowship. And this is a bit in the spirit of put your money where your mouth is. So one of the problems we have from a capital allocation perspective is that most people, the traditional investment model in the business that I work, you raise a pool of money, so you have a set of commitments. To keep the math easy, we'll say it's a $100 million fund. So you get commitments from rich folks or big institutions to have $100 million that you're going to invest in certain types of companies. And the economics are generally to run that business, that $100 million will pay a fee of about 2% plus or minus, depending on the circumstance. And then the managers will also get part of the performance if they succeed. Well, that company, that fund with $100 million will then go make some number of investments, probably 10 to 15. Let's keep the math easy. Let's say it's 10. So the average investment size that they're going to have or make is going to be around $5 to $10 million. That's what they're going to try to put to work in one company. Well, if you think about the geography problem, and we're trying to push capital and solutions and technologies and answers out as far as we can, they don't need $5 million. Right. They may need $50,000. They may need $100,000. Certainly micro-lending has done a good job on the credit side, but what about the equity side? And so our thought was to say, can we radically lower the cost structure of allocating capital into these remote places by taking incredibly committed, hardworking young people who won't quit, give them a ridiculously fast crash course in how do we do what we do, arm them with discretionary capital, their decision to make, which is what makes the education go so fast, and have them make good decisions and make good investments. We started that about 3 years ago. We're in our third group. We're eventually trying to push to our first international rollout next year, hopefully in Mexico, but so far it's been North America and Europe. And this group, and we made plenty of mistakes. The first year we made plenty of mistakes, and I won't drag you through, but it's getting better and better and better. But the experiment is to try to radically lower the cost structure of allocating money intelligently and then having that capital connected with a much bigger network that can solve problems. With a few investments they've made, they did invest in Lucky Iron Fish that I showed you earlier. They invested in a company in the Pacific Northwest called Green Zebra Groceries, which is trying to get at food deserts in North America in lower income communities. Invested in a company called Till Mobile, which is probably the riskiest of the bunch because it's software oriented, which is trying to say, how do we, and there are quite a few groups in this space which are working on how do we communicate with smallholder farmers via text messaging in a way that's fully integrated back to the SAP and Oracle systems of the big brands. Big problem, bit of a binary return profile on that deal. And then last one is one called Cooley Cooley, which a woman that was in the Peace Corps in Ghana had identified the moringa plant as a very high nutrient value plant that she wanted to try to create an export market, came to the States, developed products that are now sold in Whole Foods and other places, so she's created a cash market for a crop in the developing economies, and she's doing very, very well. Her name is Lisa Curtis. So these are really, I believe, good examples of smaller, very small allocations of capital that could be potentially very impactful. So to wrap up, so if we've got this huge problem that is distributed in nature, that's customized in all these places, how in the heck do we get all of us thinking about how do we get more or less to the same place? And if you talk to futurists, which would be a great job to have, I don't know how you get that job, but there's a futurist at Intel, and I've read some of his work. He said the answer is not to tell people what to do, but to give them a vision of where you want to go. And if you can communicate that vision and have the right processes and protocols, people behaving the right way, people will tend to go in that direction. That's how you get a large group that's not organized in the same tent, is you paint the picture of a different vision. And certainly I think rather than a vision, a binary vision of big ag GMO and organic smallholder farmer, we need a different vision. And I don't know, I can't paint that vision for you today, but I know that vision will involve words like distributed and customized. It'll involve the word profit. I think it'll involve the word honor and honesty. And so to me, if we're thinking about trying to figure out how to have a new vision, it's certainly helpful to have some role models. The one that comes to mind here, of course, and I think I would call in the ag space is probably the go-to role model we already talked about, which is Norman Borlaug. And I think of him as a great example on all of those fronts. Tenacity, won't quit, but really in the science and innovation realm. The role model I think may be more appropriate for today, or at least to the problem that I'm talking about today, is George Washington Carver. So George Washington Carver, to me, is one of the most remarkable Americans ever. And for those of you who don't know his story, he was born in 1864, a slave. His mother was kidnapped and she was never seen again when he was very young, 5 or 6. He was raised by the Carver family in the Midwest. He was the first black man to graduate or even go to school in his town. The first black man to go to his university where he graduated and went on to get a doctorate. And then he got a letter in the mail from an institution starting in Alabama, Tuskegee Institute, which was asking him to come down and see if they could help start an agricultural program there or advance the work that they had already started. And when he got there, he got off the train, so I've read. He didn't have a building, he didn't have a lab, he didn't have a plot of land to grow stuff. He had nothing. And he got some students, and they literally would find trash, and they began to build a program. They built a lab, they conducted research, and they began to develop techniques and products that in many ways saved much of the American South when the boll weevil hit and wiped out much of the cotton. Most of his work was in peanuts and sweet potatoes. He had 300 innovations from a peanut. He had 100 innovations from a sweet potato. Right. His tenacity was remarkable. His entrepreneurial framework was perfect. He went into a situation with very limited and little resources and built a great thing. Now imagine if he were here today, looking at this problem and knowing about the number of people that are hungry and how serious these issues are. What would he do? What would he do with an internet? What would he do with the ability to use advanced biotechnology? What would he do with satellite imagery? I don't know, but it's hard to imagine the kinds of solutions that he would come up with. The thing I do know, based on everything I've read about him, is that he would get up in the morning and he would put on his boots every day and he would say his morning prayers every day, which I'm told he did. He would find a problem that was in front of him and he would tackle the problem. I think that is exactly the kind of framework and mindset that we need to have as we all think about how can we engage on this issue, how can we be a player engaged in the activity. So my final comments would be this. Intellectual property on a piece of paper, in a folder, in a file drawer doesn't do anything. Intellectual property in the hands of a great company, built the right way, conducting business the right way, in a place where there's trade and in a place where there are clear property rights, is the most powerful force, positive force of good economic development on the planet today, by far, bar none. And that's why I think being here in Fort Worth with lawyers-to-be is far more important than being in Washington, D.C., at the Department of Agriculture today, or at the UN. Because this is where I believe that the answers are going to come from. But thank you very much for your time. I do appreciate it. It's great to be here.